Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. For centuries, sailors whispered of a ghostly vessel adrift in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. The ship had no name, at least none that could still be read on its rotting hull. It was a derelict, its mast broken, sails tattered, and decks covered in moss and seaweed. To most who heard the tale, it was nothing more than a sailor's yarn meant to chill the blood and deter the faint-hearted from the sea. But to those who had seen it, the derelict ship was a floating tomb, haunted by the echoes of a long-forgotten tragedy. The first recorded sighting dated back to the early 1800s, when a British merchant ship crossed paths with the derelict during a storm. The merchant captain, a man named Elias Gray, described how his crew spotted the ship looming in the fog, its broken silhouette lit by flashes of lightning. As they approached, they heard a chilling sound, the unmistakable cries of men in agony. Despite the storm's fury, Captain Gray ordered his crew to investigate. The boarding party returned pale-faced and trembling. They spoke of ghostly figures, translucent and shimmering in the dim light, reenacting scenes of their deaths. Some appeared to drown in invisible water, while others clutched their throats, as if suffocating. Unable to comprehend what they had seen, the crew fled, and Captain Gray recorded the incident in his log, calling the derelict ship a graveyard adrift. Legends grew around the derelict. Some said it was a cursed vessel whose crew had mutinied, killing one another in a frenzied battle. Others claimed it had been a plague ship, abandoned by the living but unable to find peace in death. Every account shared one common element: those who boarded the ship never returned the same. Survivors described nightmares so vivid they could still hear the screams and taste the salt air of the haunted decks. In 1923, an ambitious explorer named Dr. Harold Whittaker organized an expedition to find and study the derelict. Unlike sailors who feared the supernatural, Dr. Whittaker saw an opportunity for fame. He gathered a crew of skeptics, scientists, and experienced seamen, determined to uncover the truth behind the ghost ship. After weeks of searching, they found it. The derelict drifted eerily in calm waters, as if waiting. Its hull was encrusted with barnacles, and the figurehead, a once proud lion, had decayed into something unrecognizable. Despite the warnings of local fishermen, Whittaker's crew approached and tethered their own ship to the derelict. As night fell, an unnatural fog rolled in. The air grew cold, and the sound of distant voices carried over the water. The crew, armed with lanterns and cameras, stepped aboard the ghostly vessel. The deck creaked beneath their feet, and shadows seemed to shift in the dim light. They hadn't been aboard long before the apparitions appeared. At first they were faint, silhouettes barely distinguishable from the mist. But as midnight approached, the ghostly crew became more solid. The explorers watched in horrified fascination as the phantoms reenacted their final moments. Some were locked in combat, their ghostly swords clashing in silence. Others collapsed as if succumbing to poison or an unseen disease. One figure stood apart, a tall man in a captain's coat, his eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. He walked the deck, seemingly aware of the living intruders. As he passed by, Dr. Whittaker swore he heard the ghost whisper, "Leave or join us." Despite their terror, the explorers pressed on, determined to uncover the ship's secret. They ventured below deck, where they found a logbook, its pages miraculously preserved. The final entry, written in a trembling hand, read, "We are cursed. The sea will not take us, nor will the grave. We are bound to this ship until forgiveness finds us." As dawn approached, the apparitions grew more erratic, their movements frantic and violent. The explorers realized that something was changing. The derelict ship itself seemed to groan, as if coming alive. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the temperature plummeted. One of the crew members screamed as a ghostly hand reached for him, pulling him toward the edge of the deck. Panicked, Dr. Whittaker ordered everyone to return to their ship. They cut the ropes, tethering them to the derelict, and sailed away as fast as they could. As they put distance between themselves and the ghost ship, the fog lifted and the temperature returned to normal. From the safety of their own vessel, they watched as the derelict drifted back into the mist, vanishing as if it had never been there. The expedition returned home, but none of the crew spoke of what they had seen. Dr. Whitaker, once eager for fame, destroyed his notes and warned others never to seek the derelict. Some of the crew succumbed to madness, plagued by nightmares of the ghostly ship and its cursed crew. The derelict ship was never seen again, at least not by those who lived to tell the tale. But sailors still whisper of it on stormy nights, a graveyard adrift on the open sea, waiting for those foolish enough to come too close. Perhaps somewhere out there, the ghosts still reenact their tragic end, bound forever to the ship that refuses to sink, seeking a release that will never come. Years later, a fisherman found a strange object washed ashore, a weathered logbook, its final page torn and faded. Though most of the writing was illegible, one sentence could still be read: "Beware the derelict, for its crew is not at rest." In the heart of a small, misty town called Gray Hollow, there stood an ancient library, Hawthorne Library. It was a grand structure made of cold gray stone, with towering windows that rarely let in sunlight. The library had been there for centuries, its walls steeped in history, secrets, and something far more sinister. People spoke in hushed tones about the strange occurrences within its walls. Yet no one could resist the allure of its vast collection of rare and ancient books. For as long as anyone could remember, Hawthorne Library had been shrouded in mystery. Librarians came and went, never staying long enough to settle in. Visitors often left in a hurry, claiming they felt an unnatural chill in the air or saw books moving on their own. The townspeople dismissed these stories as exaggerations, but deep down, many believed something was truly wrong with the library. One legend, in particular, had persisted for generations. It was said that the ghost of the library's first curator, Jonathan Hawthorne, still roamed the aisles. Hawthorne had been a reclusive scholar who mysteriously vanished one stormy night over 100 years ago. His body was never found, and the only clue to his disappearance was a single open book on his desk, its pages blank except for the phrase, "Beware the knowledge that moves." One autumn afternoon, a young librarian named Eleanor Marlowe arrived at Gray Hollow. Fresh out of university and eager to prove herself, she had heard about Hawthorne Library's strange reputation, but dismissed it as local superstition. To her, it was an opportunity to work with rare books and uncover forgotten histories. On her first day, Eleanor noticed the peculiar atmosphere of the library. The air felt heavy, and the shadows seemed longer than they should have been. Despite the eerie surroundings, she set to work organizing the chaotic shelves. As she moved through the aisles, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't long before Eleanor experienced her first strange occurrence. While sorting a stack of old books in the history section, she heard a faint whisper. She looked around, but the library was empty. Shaking it off as her imagination, she continued her work, until a book flew off the shelf and landed at her feet with a loud thud. Startled, Eleanor picked up the book. It was an old leather-bound volume with no title on the cover. When she opened it, the pages were blank, save for a single sentence written in faded ink. "Seek the truth, but beware the shadows." Her heart raced, but she convinced herself it was a prank. After all, the townspeople loved to scare newcomers with ghost stories about the library. Determined not to be intimidated, she put the book back and continued her work. Over the next few weeks, the strange incidents increased. Books would fly off the shelves without warning, pages would turn on their own, and late at night, Eleanor would hear footsteps echoing through the empty aisles. Yet despite the fear these events inspired, her curiosity grew. She began to notice a pattern. The books that moved or fell always seemed to relate to a specific topic: forgotten knowledge, ancient curses, and unsolved disappearances. Intrigued, Eleanor decided to investigate. Late one night, she stayed after closing hours, armed with a lantern and her notebook. As she roamed the darkened aisles, she felt the temperature drop. The shadows seemed to deepen, and once again, she heard the faint whispering. Following the sound, she reached a secluded section of the library that housed the oldest books. There she found a hidden door behind a bookshelf. It creaked open, revealing a spiral staircase that descended into darkness. At the bottom of the staircase was a hidden chamber filled with ancient tomes, many of which bore symbols Eleanor didn't recognize. In the center of the room stood a large ornate desk covered in dust. On the desk lay a single open book, the same leather-bound volume that had fallen off the shelf weeks ago. This time, the book wasn't blank. Its pages were filled with writings about a secret order known as the Keepers of Shadows, scholars who believed that some knowledge was too dangerous to be shared. According to the book, Jonathan Hawthorne had been a member of this order, tasked with guarding forbidden texts. As Eleanor read, she felt a presence behind her. Turning slowly, she saw the faint outline of a figure, a tall man with piercing eyes, his form flickering like a candle's flame. It was Jonathan Hawthorne. "You seek answers," the ghost said in a voice that echoed through the chamber. "But knowledge comes at a cost." Eleanor trembled, but managed to ask, "What happened to you? Why is the library haunted?" Hawthorne's ghost explained that during his time as curator, he had discovered a book containing forbidden knowledge that had the power to alter reality. Fearing what might happen if it fell into the wrong hands, he tried to destroy it, but the book resisted, binding his soul to the library forever. Now the spirits of other scholars who had sought the book also haunted the library, trapped between worlds. Determined to break the curse, Eleanor asked how she could help. Hawthorne told her that the only way to free the spirits was to find the forbidden book and lock it away where it could never be opened again. With the ghost's guidance, Eleanor searched the hidden archives until she found the cursed book. Its cover was made of blackened leather, and it radiated an aura of malevolence. As she picked it up, the air grew colder, and the shadows in the room came alive, reaching for her. Summoning all her courage, Eleanor recited an incantation Hawthorne had taught her. The shadows recoiled, and the book sealed itself with an audible click. In that moment, the ghostly figures around her faded, their expressions of torment replaced by relief. "Thank you," whispered Hawthorne before he vanished, his soul finally at peace. The strange occurrences in Hawthorne Library ceased after that night. Eleanor became its permanent curator, dedicating her life to preserving its history while ensuring that the forbidden book remained hidden. Though the library no longer frightened visitors, some claimed they could still hear faint whispers in the oldest sections, as if the spirits of the past were watching over their beloved books. And so, Hawthorne Library remained a place of mystery and wonder, a sanctuary for knowledge, guarded by the memories of those who once gave their lives to protect it. In a remote valley surrounded by towering mountains and dense forests, lay the village of Dark Hollow. It was an old settlement, forgotten by most of the outside world. The villagers led simple lives, tending to their crops and livestock, unaware of the dark secret that lay beneath their feet. For centuries, rumors had circulated about an ancient underground city, hidden deep below the valley, a place of unimaginable wonder and terror. Few believed the stories, dismissing them as myths meant to scare children. But those who ventured too far into the forest or the caves often disappeared without a trace. The legend spoke of an ancient city called Solterra, built by an advanced civilization long before the mountains formed around it. Solterra was said to have thrived for centuries, its people harnessing mysterious energies from the earth. They built vast underground chambers, illuminated by glowing crystals and filled with grand temples, marketplaces, and homes carved from stone. But one day something went horribly wrong. No one knew exactly what happened. Some said the people of Solterra angered the gods, while others believed they unleashed a force they couldn't control. Whatever the cause, Solterra was sealed beneath the earth, and its inhabitants were never seen again. The legend claimed that their souls, trapped by the cataclysm, still haunted the city, restless and forgotten. One autumn afternoon, a group of explorers led by archaeologist Dr. Elizabeth Hayes arrived in Dark Hollow. Elizabeth had spent years studying ancient texts and maps that hinted at the existence of Solterra. Determined to prove the legend true, she convinced a team of historians, scientists, and adventurers to join her on an expedition. The villagers, wary of outsiders, warned Elizabeth about the dangers of the forest. An old man named Gregory, who had lived in Dark Hollow his entire life, spoke of strange sounds that echoed through the valley at night and shadows that moved without cause. But Elizabeth, driven by curiosity and ambition, dismissed the warnings as superstition. With supplies in hand and maps marked with ancient clues, the team set out into the dense forest. After hours of trekking through overgrown paths and rocky terrain, They found an entrance to a cave system hidden behind a waterfall. It was exactly as described in one of the ancient texts, a narrow passage leading deep into the earth. The explorers lit their lanterns and ventured into the cave. The air grew colder as they descended, and the walls were lined with strange symbols and carvings. Elizabeth recognized some of the symbols as ancient runes, but many were unfamiliar. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water and the sound of their footsteps. After hours of navigating narrow tunnels, they emerged into a vast chamber. What they saw took their breath away. A sprawling underground city, its buildings carved into the stone, illuminated by faintly glowing crystals embedded in the ceiling. The city was eerily beautiful, but it was also deathly silent. "We found it," Elizabeth whispered, her voice echoing through the chamber. "This is Solterra." The team spread out, exploring the ancient ruins. They found remnants of daily life, broken pottery, decayed furniture, and rusted tools. But there were no signs of human remains, only an overwhelming sense of abandonment. It was as if the entire population had vanished in an instant. As night fell, the explorers set up camp in one of the larger chambers. They gathered around a small fire, discussing their findings and speculating about what might have happened to the city's inhabitants. But as they talked, a strange sound filled the air, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The team fell silent, listening intently. The sound grew louder and shadows began to flicker on the walls, moving in unnatural ways. Suddenly, one of the explorers, a young man named Daniel, pointed toward the darkness. "Look," he gasped. Out of the shadows emerged faint, translucent figures, men, women, and children, their faces etched with sorrow. They moved silently through the city, reenacting scenes from their past lives. Some carried baskets as if they were still going to market, while others knelt in prayer at invisible altars. The sight was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Elizabeth realized they were witnessing the trapped souls of Solterra, cursed to relive their final moments for eternity. "We need to leave," she said urgently, her voice trembling. "We shouldn't be here." But as the team began packing up, the ground trembled. The air grew thick, and a chilling voice echoed through the chamber. "You cannot leave. You have disturbed our rest." Panic set in as the shadows grew darker and more solid. The ghosts turned toward the explorers, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. One by one, the spirits began to approach, their forms shifting between human and something far more sinister. "Run!" Elizabeth shouted. The team sprinted toward the tunnel they had come from, but the ground continued to shake, and the walls of the city seemed to close in around them. The spirits pursued them, their wails growing louder and more piercing. Just as they reached the entrance to the tunnel, a massive shadow rose before them, blocking their path. Elizabeth, thinking quickly, pulled out an ancient pendant she had found in one of the ruins. It bore the same symbols as the carvings on the walls. Holding it up, she shouted an incantation she had read in the ancient texts. The shadow recoiled and the spirits paused. Seizing the opportunity, the team dashed through the tunnel, not stopping until they emerged into the forest above. Behind them, the entrance to the cave collapsed, sealing the city once more. Back in Dark Hollow, the villagers listened in awe as Elizabeth and her team recounted their ordeal. Though they were relieved to have escaped, they knew they had only scratched the surface of Solterra's mystery. Elizabeth, forever changed by the experience, vowed never to return, but she also knew she couldn't let the city's story be forgotten. Years later, Elizabeth published a book about Solterra, detailing the legend and their harrowing encounter. Some dismissed it as fiction, but those who had been there knew the truth. Solterra remained hidden beneath the earth, its restless souls still trapped, waiting for the day when someone else might dare to disturb their eternal vigil. And in the quiet nights of Dark Hollow, if you listen closely, you could still hear the faint, mournful wails of the forgotten city below. For years, travelers passing through the sleepy town of Hollow Creek had whispered about a spectral train station that appeared only at the stroke of midnight. Known locally as the Midnight Station, it was said to emerge from the mist on abandoned train tracks just outside town. According to the legend, those who entered the station never returned. Some said it was a portal to another world. Others believed it was a trap laid by restless spirits. Skeptics dismissed it as nothing more than folklore, but the stories persisted, growing darker with each retelling. No one knew why the station appeared or where the train that arrived at its platform went. But one thing was certain: the midnight station was not a place for the living. When Clara Bennett, an aspiring journalist, heard about the midnight station, she was immediately intrigued. A lover of mysteries and urban legends, she saw the story as her chance to make a name for herself. Clara had been visiting her grandmother in Hollow Creek for a few weeks, spending her days wandering the quiet streets and gathering tales from the locals. But the midnight station was unlike anything she'd encountered before. "You're wasting your time, dear," her grandmother said one evening as Clara pored over her notes. "It's just a story parents tell to keep their kids away from the old tracks." "Then why does everyone have a different version of the same story?" Clara countered. Her grandmother sighed. "Because people like to believe in things they can't explain. But take my advice. Don't go looking for it. Some mysteries are better left unsolved." Clara ignored the warning. Armed with a camera, flashlight, and notebook, she made her way to the abandoned tracks on the night of the next full moon. The tracks lay hidden beneath overgrown grass and twisted vines, stretching into the darkness like a forgotten relic. Clara set up her equipment near an old railway sign that read, "Hollow Creek Junction." Its letters faded and rusted. The air was unnervingly still, the usual chorus of crickets and rustling leaves eerily absent. Clara checked her watch. It was 11:45 p.m. As the minutes ticked by, a thick fog began to roll in, shrouding the area in a ghostly haze. Clara felt a chill creep up her spine, but she shook it off. "It's just the weather," she told herself, gripping her flashlight tightly. At exactly midnight, a low, mournful whistle pierced the silence. Clara's breath caught as the fog parted, revealing the outline of a train station where there had been nothing moments before. The structure was impossibly intact, its iron beams gleaming under the pale moonlight. A flickering sign above the entrance read, "Hollow Creek Station." She approached cautiously, her flashlight illuminating the cobblestone platform. The station seemed frozen in time, its benches polished, and a clock on the wall stopped at midnight. Gas lamps along the platform flickered with an otherworldly glow. Clara raised her camera, snapping pictures as she moved closer. Her heart raced with a mix of fear and exhilaration. Then she heard it, a train approaching. The sound of wheels grinding against the tracks grew louder, accompanied by another mournful whistle. Through the fog, Clara saw the train emerge. Its exterior shimmered, as if made of liquid silver, and its windows glowed faintly with a ghostly light. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors slid open with an eerie hiss. Clara hesitated, staring into the empty carriages. The air seemed to hum with an unspoken invitation. "Step aboard," a voice whispered. Clara whirled around, but no one was there. Against her better judgment, she took a tentative step toward the train. Inside, the train was both beautiful and unsettling. The seats were upholstered in rich velvet, and chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting soft light. But it was the passengers that made Clara's blood run cold. The carriages were filled with people dressed in outdated clothing, Victorian gowns, 1920s flapper dresses, and World War II uniforms. They sat in eerie silence, their faces pale and their eyes blank. Clara moved cautiously down the aisle, her camera clicking. The passengers didn't react to her presence, as if they were frozen in time. At the end of the car, an old conductor stood, his uniform pristine. He turned to Clara, his face shadowed beneath his cap. "Ticket?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I don't have one," Clara stammered. The conductor tilted his head. "Everyone has a ticket. Yours is simply unwritten." Before Clara could respond, the train lurched forward. She grabbed a nearby pole for balance, panic rising in her chest. "I don't want to go anywhere," she said, her voice shaking. The conductor smiled faintly. "This train goes where it is needed. You are here for a reason." The words sent a chill through Clara. "What do you mean? What reason?" Instead of answering, the conductor gestured toward the window. Outside, the fog swirled, revealing scenes from Clara's past. A childhood argument with her mother, a painful breakup, the funeral of her father. "You carry the weight of these moments," the conductor said. "The midnight station offers a choice. Confront them or remain forever. The train slowed, stopping at a platform that wasn't there before. Outside, Clara saw her childhood home bathed in twilight. The scene was achingly familiar, but something was off. There were shadows moving within, distorted and wrong. "If you wish to leave, you must face what you fear most," the conductor said, his expression unreadable. Clara hesitated, her instincts screaming to stay on the train. But she knew she couldn't run forever. With a deep breath, she stepped onto the platform. Inside the house, the shadows came alive. They took the forms of her regrets and fears, her mother's disappointed gaze, her ex-boyfriend's angry words, the sound of her father's final breath. Clara fought against the memories, reliving each painful moment. But as she confronted them, the shadows began to dissipate, their forms unraveling like smoke. "You are stronger than you believe," the conductor's voice echoed in her mind. When Clara stepped back onto the platform, the train was waiting. The passengers, still silent, watched her with newfound clarity in their eyes. The conductor nodded approvingly. "You've earned your departure," he said. The train carried her back to Hollow Creek, vanishing just as the first light of dawn broke through the fog. Clara's experience changed her. She returned to the town with a newfound sense of purpose, documenting the midnight station in a best-selling book. While many dismissed her story as fiction, those who had seen the station knew the truth. To this day, the midnight station appears at the stroke of midnight, offering its passengers a chance to confront their past, or remain lost forever in its ghostly embrace. In the quiet town of Blackwood, nestled deep in the forest, people whispered about an urban legend that sent chills down the spines of even the bravest souls. They spoke of a figure in the shadows, a vague humanoid silhouette that appeared in the corners of rooms, alleys, or even in the periphery of vision. At first it would seem barely there, a wisp of darkness blending with its surroundings. But as time passed, if ignored, the figure would grow more solid, more tangible, and far more menacing. It started with Sarah Whitmore, a college student who had recently moved back to Blackwood to care for her ailing mother. Sarah was practical and skeptical, dismissing the local legends as superstition. That changed one night when she was studying late in her childhood bedroom. As the clock ticked past midnight, she noticed a faint shadow in the corner of the room. It looked like a smudge of darkness, but something about it felt wrong. She brushed it off as her imagination and went back to her textbooks. The next night, the shadow returned, darker and more defined. This time it looked vaguely human, with a head and shoulders that seemed to loom in the corner. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, but she told herself it was just a trick of the light. She ignored it. By the third night, the figure was unmistakable. It had the shape of a person, tall and thin, standing motionless in the same corner. Sarah tried turning on all the lights, but the figure didn't disappear. It was as if it were anchored to the shadows themselves. Her mother, Margaret, noticed Sarah's pale face at breakfast the next morning. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Margaret said, her voice hoarse from her illness. "It's nothing," Sarah lied, unwilling to worry her mother. But that night, as Sarah tried to sleep, the figure moved for the first time. It stepped forward, just one deliberate step, but it was enough to send Sarah bolting from her room. She spent the rest of the night on the couch, the living room bathed in the glow of the television. Desperate for answers, Sarah confided in her childhood friend, Mark, who still lived in town. Mark was fascinated by the paranormal and had always been intrigued by Blackwood's eerie reputation. "I've heard of this before," Mark said, flipping through an old book in his cluttered apartment. "It's called the lingering shadow. Supposedly, it's a manifestation of neglect, something that grows stronger when ignored. People say it feeds on apathy." "That's ridiculous," Sarah replied, though her trembling hands betrayed her fear. "It's just a shadow." Mark gave her a grave look. "If you keep ignoring it, it won't be just a shadow. It'll become real." That night, armed with Mark's advice, Sarah returned to her room. The shadow was waiting for her, more solid than ever. It stood in the center of the room now, its head tilted as if watching her. She forced herself to speak, her voice shaky but firm. "What do you want?" The shadow didn't respond, but its form flickered, as if her words had disrupted it. Encouraged, Sarah continued, demanding to know why it was haunting her. The figure didn't vanish, but it didn't step closer either. Sarah spent the entire night staring at it, refusing to look away. Over the next few days, Sarah noticed something unsettling. The shadow would vanish during the day, but reappear at night, always a little closer than before. Even when she acknowledged it, its presence didn't weaken. It only paused its advance. She began to hear faint whispers when the shadow was near, incoherent murmurs that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Mark suggested they dig deeper into the town's history, hoping to find a connection to the entity. Their research led them to the story of Thomas Grayson, a reclusive man who had lived in Blackwood a century ago. Grayson had been ostracized by the townsfolk, ignored and shunned until he died alone in his decrepit home. Legend claimed that his bitterness and despair had created a curse, a shadow that embodied his longing for attention and revenge. Sarah and Mark realized the shadow was not just an entity, it was a reflection of Grayson's anguish, and it sought recognition to regain its form. The more it was ignored, the more desperate it became, solidifying until it could act upon its rage. They devised a plan to confront the shadow directly, believing that acknowledging its pain might lay it to rest. Armed with candles, mirrors, and courage, they returned to Sarah's room that night. The shadow was waiting, fully solid now, its featureless form radiating malice. The air grew heavy as they lit the candles, their flickering light casting the shadow's form against the walls. Sarah spoke to it, her voice steady. "Thomas Grayson, we know who you are. We acknowledge your pain. But this isn't your place anymore. You need to move on." The shadow trembled, its form flickering like a dying flame. For a moment it seemed to hesitate, as if Sarah's words had reached something human within it. But the shadow wasn't ready to let go. It lunged at Sarah, its form no longer bound to the walls. Mark shouted, throwing a mirror in its path. The mirror shattered, and for a brief moment, the shadow's form splintered, its pieces scattering across the room. Energized by their success, they continued to confront the shadow, using light and words to weaken it. Each time they spoke its name, its form grew less distinct, as though the recognition it craved was also its undoing. Finally, with one last whispered apology, Sarah held up a candle directly in front of the shadow. Its form flickered and then dissolved, fading into the darkness from which it had come. The shadow never returned, but Sarah and Mark knew better than to dismiss the legend entirely. They warned the townsfolk of Blackwood to remember the story of Thomas Grayson, ensuring his name was never forgotten again. Sarah, however, couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow's essence lingered somewhere, waiting for another person to ignore the creeping darkness. To this day, in the quiet corners of Blackwood, some claim to see a faint shadow in their periphery, a figure that only grows more solid when overlooked. And those who dismiss it as a trick of the light often find themselves regretting their indifference too late. Long ago, in the mountainous kingdom of Varan, there was a blacksmith named Kalen renowned for his unparalleled craftsmanship. His swords were not only weapons, but works of art, etched with intricate designs and forged with metal so pure, they seemed to hum with power. Nobles, warriors, and kings sought Kalen's blades, each paying a fortune for his work. But Kalen's heart held darkness. Beneath his mastery lay a grudge, a deep resentment for the kingdom that had taken everything from him. Years earlier, his family had been slaughtered in a nobleman's feud, and though the king had promised justice, none came. Kalen lived only for vengeance. One stormy night, Kalen worked late in his forge, shaping his masterpiece, a sword unlike any he had ever made. He infused it with a piece of his soul, pouring his hatred and sorrow into the blade. When it was complete, the sword gleamed darkly, its edge razor-sharp, and its hilt engraved with runes of betrayal. "This blade will bring ruin," Kalen whispered, his voice trembling with fury, "to all who wield it." Kalen named the sword Solvale, meaning the silent betrayal. Its curse was insidious. Whoever wielded it would find their strength unmatched, their enemies falling like wheat before a scythe, but the blade would slowly turn against them, compelling the wielder to slay the people they loved most. Solvale's first wielder was a knight named Sir Draven, who purchased it to protect his family from marauding invaders. The blade sang in battle, cutting through armor and flesh with ease. Draven became a legend, his victories celebrated across the land. But then the nightmares began. Draven dreamed of the sword whispering to him, urging him to turn its edge on his wife and son. At first, he resisted, locking the blade away. Yet every time he wielded it again, he felt its pull growing stronger. One fateful night, Drebin awoke to find himself standing over his son's bed, Solveig in hand. When his family was found dead the next morning, Drebin was nowhere to be seen. Over the centuries, Solveig passed from hand to hand. Warriors, bandits, and even kings wielded it, drawn to its unparalleled power. Every wielder thought themselves immune to the curse, believing their will stronger than the blade's malevolence. But Solveig was patient. It whispered in dreams, sowed doubts in waking hours, and waited for moments of weakness. One by one, its wielders succumbed, leaving trails of tragedy and blood. In time, the sword's legend grew. Stories spread of a blade so powerful it could cut through mountains, but so cursed it would destroy anyone who dared wield it. Solveig became an object of fear, locked away in vaults and hidden in tombs. Yet it always found its way back into the world, as if seeking new victims. In a small village near the Varenian border, a young blacksmith named Rowan discovered Solveig buried beneath the ruins of an ancient battlefield. The blade was caked in dirt and rust, but as Rowan cleaned it, he marveled at its beauty. He knew nothing of its dark history, only that it was the finest weapon he had ever seen. Rowan's village was under constant threat from raiders, and Solveig seemed like a gift from the gods. He took up the sword to defend his people, and with it, he became unstoppable. The raiders fled before him, their forces decimated in every encounter. The villagers hailed Rowan as a hero, their savior. He relished the praise, believing he had finally found his purpose. But then the dreams began. Rowan saw visions of his sister, Lena, the only family he had left, lying lifeless at his feet. He heard Solveig's voice, cold and insistent. "She will betray you. Strike first." Rowan dismissed the dreams as nightmares born of exhaustion, but the sword's whispers grew louder, invading his thoughts even during the day. He found himself growing paranoid, questioning Lena's actions, her words, her loyalty. One night, after returning from a battle, Rowan overheard Lena speaking with a neighboring village elder. Her words were innocent, a discussion about trade and supplies. But to Rowan, twisted by the sword's influence, they sounded like treachery. Unable to resist the blade's compulsion, Rowan confronted Lena. Solveig felt heavy in his hand, yet impossibly alive, as if guiding his movements. "Why would you betray me?" he demanded, his voice breaking. Lena stared at him, bewildered. "Betray you? Rowan, I don't understand." But the sword whispered again, louder this time. "She lies." In a moment of blind rage and sorrow, Rowan struck. The blade cut cleanly, and Lena fell to the ground, her eyes wide with shock and pain. As the light left her eyes, Rowan realized what he had done. "No," he whispered, dropping the sword. "What have I done?" Solveig lay on the ground, its dark surface glinting as if mocking him. Overcome with guilt, Rowan vowed to destroy the cursed blade. He sought out scholars, priests, and mages, hoping to find a way to break the curse. Many refused to help, fearing the sword's power, while others tried and failed. Finally, an old hermit told Rowan the truth. The sword cannot be destroyed by mortal hands, but its creator might have left a way to end its curse. Rowan's journey led him to the ruins of Kaelin's forge, high in the mountains. There he found the ghost of the blacksmith, still bound to the place where he had created his cursed masterpiece. Kaelin's ghost was twisted and bitter, his resentment undimmed by the centuries. "You think you can undo what I've done?" he sneered. "This blade is my vengeance, my legacy." Rowan pleaded with Kaelin, telling him of the countless lives destroyed by Solveig, of the loved ones lost, including his own sister. For a moment, Kaelin faltered, the weight of his actions flickering across his spectral face. "If you truly wish to end the curse," Kaelin said, "then offer the blade the one thing it craves most, the soul of its wielder." Rowan understood what he had to do. He took up Solveig one last time and drove it into his own heart. As the blade pierced him, he felt its power surge, its whispers silenced at last. Kaelin's ghost faded, his soul finally at peace. Solveig shattered, its pieces scattering into the wind, never to harm another. Rowan's sacrifice was not in vain. His village remembered him as a hero, and the legend of Solveig became a cautionary tale, a story of love, betrayal, and redemption. But some say on quiet nights you can still hear the faint hum of the shattered blade, a reminder of the price of vengeance. The old chapel on the edge of the sleepy town of Willow Creek was an architectural marvel, with its stained glass windows casting kaleidoscopic light and ivy creeping up its ancient stone walls. But it wasn't the beauty of the chapel that kept the townsfolk talking. It was the legend of the bride. Every local knew the story. Decades ago, a young woman named Lillian Rosewood had died tragically on her wedding day. Since then, her restless spirit was said to haunt the chapel, forever mourning the life she never got to live. People claimed to hear sobbing at night, to see the ghostly figure of a bride standing at the altar, her veil fluttering as though moved by an unseen wind. The townspeople avoided the chapel at night. Some avoided it altogether. But for Emily Warren, an ambitious journalist looking to make a name for herself, the tale of the ghost bride was an irresistible story waiting to be uncovered. Emily had recently moved to Willow Creek, drawn by its charm and steeped history. The story of the haunted chapel was exactly the kind of sensational piece she needed to launch her career. Despite warnings from locals, she decided to investigate. She started with the town's records, uncovering details of Lillian Rosewood's life. Lillian had been the daughter of a wealthy landowner. Her wedding to Edward Thatcher, a humble school teacher, had been the talk of the town, a union that defied societal expectations. But tragedy struck on the wedding day. According to newspaper clippings, a fire had broken out in the chapel during the ceremony. Lillian had perished in the blaze, and Edward, devastated, had disappeared shortly afterward. Some claimed he had taken his own life, while others whispered that he had been driven mad by grief. Emily's curiosity deepened. What had caused the fire? And why did Lillian's spirit remain tethered to the chapel? Determined to experience the haunting herself, Emily decided to spend a night in the chapel. Armed with a notebook, a voice recorder, and a camera, she arrived at dusk. The chapel was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and faint traces of incense. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped, and an unnatural stillness settled over the room. Emily sat in one of the pews, her senses on high alert. Hours passed, and she began to wonder if the legend was nothing more than a myth. Then just after midnight, she heard it, a soft, mournful sobbing. Emily's breath caught. The sound seemed to echo from the altar. She gripped her flashlight and crept forward, her heart pounding. At first, she saw nothing. But then, in the pale moonlight streaming through the stained glass windows, a figure materialized. A woman in a tattered wedding dress, her veil obscuring her face. "Lillian," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. The figure turned toward her. Though the veil covered her features, Emily could feel the weight of her sorrow. "Why are you here?" the ghost asked, her voice a haunting melody of pain and longing. "I want to know your story," Emily said, summoning her courage. "Why are you still here?" The ghost hesitated, then began to speak. "I cannot leave, Juana," Lillian said. "Not until the truth is known. Not until justice is served." Lillian's words sent chills down Emily's spine. "What truth?" she asked. "The fire." Lillian's voice faltered. "It was no accident. Someone wanted me gone." Before Emily could ask more, the ghost faded, leaving her alone in the chapel. The next morning, Emily delved deeper into the town's history. She uncovered rumors of a rivalry between Lillian's family and another prominent family in the town, the Whitmores. The two families had feuded over land for years, and Lillian's marriage to Edward, who had ties to the Whitmores, had further inflamed tensions. Emily began to suspect that the fire had been intentionally set. But who would go to such lengths, and why? Emily interviewed elderly residents who still remembered the tragedy. One woman, Mrs. Harlow, offered a chilling revelation. Lillian's father, Charles Rosewood, was furious about the wedding, Mrs. Harlow said. He thought Edward wasn't good enough for her. There were whispers that he threatened to stop the wedding at any cost. Emily's investigation also led her to an old caretaker of the chapel, Thomas Grayson, who had been a boy at the time of the fire. "I saw someone that day," Thomas admitted reluctantly, "a man with a lantern sneaking around the back of the chapel. I thought nothing of it then, but now..." The pieces began to fall into place. Emily suspected that Charles Rosewood had orchestrated the fire to prevent the marriage. But his plan had gone horribly wrong, costing his daughter her life. That night, Emily returned to the chapel to share what she had learned. At midnight, Lillian's ghost appeared once more. "I know the truth," Emily said. "Your father caused the fire. He didn't want you to marry Edward." Lillian's form flickered, her sorrow giving way to anger. "I suspected as much," she said. "But I need proof. Only then can I find peace." Emily remembered the records she had found, documents suggesting that Charles had paid large sums of money to local officials after the fire. She promised Lillian she would find the evidence needed to expose the truth. Emily scoured the town archives, eventually discovering a journal belonging to Charles Rosewood. In it, he had confessed his guilt, writing, "I only meant to scare them, to stop the wedding. I never wanted her to die, but the fire spread too quickly. I cannot forgive myself, but I must protect my name." Armed with this damning evidence, Emily returned to the chapel. "I found it," she told Lillian's ghost, holding up the journal. "The world will know what happened to you." Lillian's ghost wept, but this time her tears were of gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "You've given me what I've waited for all these years. I can finally rest." As the first light of dawn broke through the stained glass windows, Lillian's ghost began to fade, her form dissolving into a soft golden light. Emily's story about Lillian Rosewood became a nationwide sensation. The chapel, once shrouded in fear and mystery, was restored and became a symbol of love and resilience. Though Lillian's ghost was gone, her story lived on, ensuring she was never forgotten. And Emily, who had uncovered the truth, found not just professional success, but also a deep connection to the tragic bride whose spirit had finally been set free.